For around a year, I rented a first-floor flat that had a view of an old cemetery. At the time, I thought life after death, ghosts, and the paranormal were all an absolute load of rubbish, so it really didn't bother me. In fact, I liked the idea that I had no neighbors behind me. But I didn't feel that way for long. There was a shop under me, a small newsagent, that closed at 6 p.m., so when I started hearing sounds that woke me up during the night, I knew it couldn't be coming from down there. Around 3 months after moving in, I had heard the same noise on many nights and decided it sounded like a woman crying, but in a sad, heartbroken way, though it sounded muffled or far away. The first few nights it happened, I got out of bed and looked out of my front window that faced the street, but never saw anyone that could be the source of the crying. Up to that point, I hadn't even thought to look out of my back window. All there was out there was the old cemetery, and it was hard to believe someone would be out there at night. It had no streetlights out there. But this one night I woke up around 2 a.m. to the same crying, and I thought, this is too much. Who would be upset for this amount of time? So I once again got up, and this time I opened my front window and my back, then sat on my bed and just listened. It was clear to me then that the crying was coming from the cemetery. I was a little surprised, but went to look out of my window, and as my eyes adjusted to the dark outside, I could see a figure crouched in front of a gravestone. It really surprised me. I did not expect to see anyone in a cemetery in the middle of the night, especially a woman, and the sight of her scared me so much. I could see no details, only the outline of a person, kneeling or crouching, and I closed my window and went back to my bed. I spent an hour wondering what to do about the situation. What was going on out there? Who would I even call? Would anyone choose to grieve in a dark cemetery in the middle of the night? The following few nights I heard her crying once or twice, but had been so scared when I saw her I just stayed in bed and didn't dare look out. But on the fourth night I plucked up the courage to have a look. I was so scared, but at the same time, really curious. This time I really wish I hadn't. As I stood at my window focusing, the figure came into view, but now she wasn't crouched. She was standing. What made my blood run cold, though, was she was facing me, terrified. I ran to my bed and my mind was reeling at what I'd seen. And it wasn't that I was able to see any facial features. It was too dark and far away for that. I just knew deep inside that whoever that was out there wanted me to know that she saw me. I lay on my bed, not even daring to get under the covers, and spent the rest of that night trying to make sense of what was happening, and becoming increasingly convinced that my beliefs on the paranormal had been wrong all of my life, because this surely felt very not normal to me. The next day, I decided that I needed to go to the area I was seeing this person, if that's what it was. Things never seem as scary during the day. It was around noon when I ventured out, and I really didn't know what I was going to see, if anything. Once I got into the cemetery, I realized that it was so hard to even identify where I'd seen her exactly, as everything looked so different from my window, but I headed to where I guessed would be close. I browsed the headstones as I walked, and noticed that they were mainly from the late 1800s to early 1900s. None of them were visited anymore that I could see. No flowers on any of them. I looked back at my bedroom window to find a frame of reference, but it was useless. I wasn't going to be able to pinpoint where I was seeing the figure exactly. Just as I was about to give up and head home, I walked into what felt like an invisible wall of emotion. For no reason at all, I felt despair and such deep sadness and grief. It was so intense it stopped me in my tracks. I actually had tears in my eyes, but I knew they weren't mine. None of these emotions were mine. My eyes were drawn to the headstone I was standing beside, and even before I read the inscription, I knew that this was where the crying lady had been. There was no doubt in my mind. I felt it, though I can't explain how. The words chiseled into the stone read, "Our daughter, Alice Mary Norton, born September 3rd, 1876, died October 24th, 1879. Fly with the..." The words were too worn to read after that point, but I'm positive it would have said, "The Angels." From the next weekend, until I moved from there when I changed jobs, I put a small bunch of flowers on that grave, every other Saturday. I never heard the lady crying again, but even though I never looked out again after dark, I still felt that the lady, who I'm sure was the spirit of the child's mother, was still out there. When I was a teenager, I spent most of my evenings at a friend's house about a mile from where I lived, mostly because his parents were more accommodating than mine, and we could have a lot more fun and make a noise. In the winter, it was normally after dark that I left to go home, and the shortest route took me past an old church and graveyard with a stone wall that was around my shoulder height. I could see into the graveyard, but I tended not to look as it was pretty spooky after dark. But one night, I heard what sounded like a man's voice, and he sounded upset as I was passing, so I instinctively looked over the wall into the darkness, but I couldn't make anything out apart from the headstones that were closest to me in the streetlights. I know I should have shouted hello or something, but as soon as I looked in that direction, the voice stopped and it was too creepy, so I just carried on walking and thought to myself, it's most likely someone messing around in there. I didn't go to my friends the following night as my parents had asked me to watch my little sister as they were going out, but the next night I did, and as I was passing the graveyard on my way home, I heard what sounded like someone running around in there, so without looking, I started running and ran all of the way home. I couldn't help but think about it when I got back home, but I started to think that maybe my friend was pranking me and heading there after I left his house. So the next day at school I said to him, "So you like graveyards then, do you?" And he looked at me confused. So I told him about the two events, and he said, "Yeah, I'm gonna go into that place in the dark to scare you." I'd be scaring myself more, and I could tell he wasn't lying. He was of the opinion that someone was fooling around in there, probably kids, and we dropped the subject. That night, as I was leaving my friends, he handed me a flashlight and said, "If they are there again, shine that on them and shout, 'Hey,' they'll panic and run." It sounded like a good idea to me, so I took it and headed off. As I neared the graveyard, I started doubting that I had the guts to shine the flashlight in there if I did hear anything. But as I started walking alongside the wall, it was silent at first, and then out of nowhere, I heard a thud, and I quickly turned on the flashlight and aimed it over the wall. Not more than 20 feet from me, and facing the light was a man, and I stopped breathing with the shock. He was dressed as a pastor or something, and I quickly turned off the flashlight and started walking. I was so scared by now I was shaking. I mean, why would he be there in the dark? As I walked, every hair on my body stood up, and I fixed my sights on the end of the wall and was terrified that he was behind me. Suddenly I heard running from behind the wall. My stomach knotted, and I was just about to sprint, but right near the end of the graveyard in front of me, that pastor came through the wall, stood staring at me for a second, then walked straight back through it, a solid stone wall. By now, I was out of my senses. I froze for a second, not knowing what to do, then came to, and ran like the wind in the opposite direction and back to my friend's house. My friend and his parents listened to me ramble as it poured out of me, and I have no idea what they believed, but his dad drove me home as they could see how shaken I was. I never went to my friends for at least a week, and when I did start going, I never went home past the church again.